Right, we appear to be recording. Can you hear me all right, everyone? Good. So I'm Tim, I'm an alcoholic. Uh, Thank you for being here. I'd feel pretty foolish just talking at a screen. So concept 7. Let's read out the World Service long form. The conference recognises that the Charter and the bylaws of the General Service Board are legal instruments, that the trustees are thereby fully empowered to manage and conduct all of the World Service affairs of Alcoholics Anonymous. It is further understood that the conference charter itself is not a legal document, that it relies instead upon the force of tradition and the power of the AA purse for its final effectiveness. Now, for this to make any sense, we need to put it in context. So, to sum up, there is such a thing as a universal consciousness in the universe, and that gets channeled through the individual consciousnesses of individual members into group consciences of Alcoholics Anonymous groups. Those groups elect GSRs who carry that conscience to meetings of which those consciences are presented to the delegates. The delegates meet and form a conference, which becomes the effective voice of Alcoholics Anonymous as a whole. But conference can't do anything. It meets once a year. It can make very, very high-level decisions. That's it. So you need a structure to implement. So if the conference is the mind, the structure below that is the body, which implements the recommendations of the mind. The body is not autonomous. Now that structure is headed up by the board, and I'd like to make, if I may, a metaphysical distinction between the mind of conference and the mind of the board. The mind of conference is like a sort of meditative state which is in contact with all sorts of higher realms and angels, if one believes in such things, and certainly the higher power. Whereas the mind of the board, although it's got a bit of a hotline to the upstairs, is much more like the physical brain, which is trained to perform all sorts of actions automatically. I'm sure if you have a complex job, which you've been doing for decades, let's say you have to produce a document and based on all sorts of different pieces of data and interactions with other people. I very much doubt you stop 147 times a day to contact your higher power for direct guidance on, how to structure the sentence, where to put the comma, how to embolden a line. All of this happens automatically. The computer is running. There is an ultimate connection with mind, but it's essentially, this is mind as in the physical brain, which is part of the physical body. I don't know about your brain, your brains. I'm sure you have one each. That your brains. Well, mine has the ability to come up with all sorts of rubbish all by itself. I'm not activating it. It just it's got its own circuits which fire up and shoot out rubbish. This is not my mind. This is just the physical brain doing all sorts of crap. And it's very important for me not to take that seriously. There's a big difference between thoughts, genuine thoughts, which come from higher realms and get channeled through my physical brain. There's a big difference between those and just the misfirings of corrupted circuitry. Now, I'm not saying that the board represents misfirings of corrupted circuitry. Heaven forbid, chas v'sholem. But there is a distinction between the type of thinking at conference level and the type of thinking at board level. The type of thinking at conference level is about large matters of policy and finance, these general policy decisions, whereas the thinking of the board involves implementing those in thousands of intricate and minute ways through its various bodies. So just a reminder, the board does things in three ways. The trustees can do something themselves, they can establish a subcommittee to do things, or they can establish corporations, hire a director, and exercise what's referred to as custodial oversight. But it does three types of things. Now, let's get back to this tradition. Oh, just one thing about the previous tradition. The previous tradition, 6, draws a distinction between the major decisions of policy and finance and the board, which has chief initiative and active responsibility, which means it takes the lead in implementing the recommendations of conference. Now, this is so exciting for me. I don't know if it is for you. Concept 7 says that the charter and bylaws, whatever they are, of the General Service Board, these are legal instruments. So it looks legally and materially like the board is governed by these instruments. The board is not governed by conference under law. It's governed by its constitutional documents, the same way that when a company is set up, it's governed by its constitutional documents, its memorandum and articles of association, or whatever the legal instruments are. So it looks like the board can do whatever it wants. It looks at its memorandum, its charter, its bylaws, its whatever, and says, well, we're going to do what we're going to do. No one can stop us. There's those internal constitutional documents, and there are the laws of the land. So Alcoholics Anonymous is incorporated, or rather, not the fellowship isn't, but the legal body is a charity, so it's subject to corporate law. It's subject to charities law in particular. So that's what it looks like at the material level. The board doesn't look as though it's accountable to AA. It looks like a completely separate organisation. And what it says in the concept is the board is fully empowered to manage and conduct all of the World Service affairs in two ways, in terms of what it does, so that's its policies, and how it spends the money in order to achieve that. Policy and finance, that little pair go together. That is in parallel to step 11, where it talks about knowledge of God's will for us, which is the policy, and the power to carry that out. The resources, that's the finance, policy and finance, knowledge of God's will for us and the power to carry that out. Now let's just set aside the board and look at what the conference charter is. If you read the conference charter, and I'll give you a Snickers bar if you do, the conference charter, it says that conference is composed largely of delegates that represent the fellowship. Now, it also has board members, but it largely represents the fellowship. It has the board members to create this continuity, so the board is not just called in for the decisions, they get involved in the decisions. But that's to do with a different concept. So conference represents the fellowship. Now, the way these two are joined together, the conference and the board, we've got to hold two ideas in our minds at the same time. The first one is that the board has legal power. So in the material realm, it's in charge. But without the direction of conference, without conference giving it recommendations, without the practical support of the fellowship, and without the finances of the fellowship, what's it going to do? How's it going to decide what to do on a Monday? It has nothing to go on. The physical framework provided by the charter, the bylaws, corporate law, charities law, whatever else, all it is a framework. So your body does not give you your purpose in your life. however well equipped your body is for various functions, well, what are you going to do? You need access to a higher realm to decide what to do. It's just an instrument. That's all it is. And let's look at how that works in practice. Let's say the General Service Board likes to keep a directory of meetings and publish it online. Unless groups continue to supply details of their meetings, within a few months it's going to be completely obsolete and useless. The board can't do what it does without the support of the fellowship. If volunteers aren't sent in to man the telephones, to person the telephones, then the telephones won't get answered. If no money is sent by groups, they can't pay their staff. So it's all very well being formally subject to its own charter and bylaws. From a practical point of view, without the brain, the body, there's not a lot the body can do, or rather, without the mind. The brain seems to be able to do an awful lot on its own, but without the mind, nothing of value can be achieved. And essentially, the power source comes from above, but that's not formalized in any legal document. That's just true. It's just the way things work. So ultimately, the board is bound by the will of the fellowship and by the money it supplies and by the volunteers it supplies. And so the power of the fellowship acts like an invisible force field, which becomes visible only when it's activated. In other words, it's only when something goes wrong that you realize it's there. It's only when the board starts to go against what the conference recommendations are that people start to squeak and squeal. That's when you start to realize that there is this higher force acting on the board, which is not enshrined in law, but is just as real. And so that's the real framework within which the board operates, is this higher realm of what conference wants. Now, there's one point I'm not fully in agreement with Bill. I'm sure he's right, but I can't see how. He says the trustees are not salaried, which is correct. And according to him, he says because they're not salaried, they wouldn't dream of legally contesting the clear and sustained will of the conference. What I see actually in practice is there's quite a lot of resistance from the board in Great Britain at times to very strongly and widely expressed views throughout the fellowship of AA in Great Britain. I'm not going to mention particular topics, but there's been one over the last couple of years where it's what the board has done is really put the cat amongst the pigeons, and it's been impossible to get any substantive information out of the board. Or any real sense that they're responding to what the fellowship actually wants. So the board does seem to oppose on occasion the will of the fellowship. You could argue if they were salaried and had a vested interest in the goodwill of the fellowship through their pockets, they might toe the line more. But that's a subjective speculation. It's my view. So I differ with Bill on that one for what it's worth. So the power of the AA purse, people always bang on about the power of the purse. Now, according to the way the concept is written, conference could turn off the flow of funds. However, in practice, it's not conference which is in charge of the flow of funds. In Great Britain, you've got groups, below that you have intergroups, below that you have regions, below that you have conference, but regions and intergroup pass their money, or well, groups sometimes pass their money directly, but mostly pass it to intergroup. Intergroups sometimes pass money directly, but mostly pass it to region, and then region passes money to the charity. It doesn't pass it through conference. Conference doesn't have a bank account. So if conference says we don't want to give the board any more money, it has no power to enact that. What it would have to do, so no direct power, what it would have to, because it has no bank account, so it can't stop the flow. Certainly can't stop groups or intergroups or regions. They have, conference has no power over those levels because they are higher. But what conference can do is report back and say, oi, this is what's going on the board. We don't like it. They refuse to comply. We're going to suggest that we turn off the tap. So in practice, the mechanism is slightly indirect, and there's no way of actually stopping the funds. If conference wants to stop the funds, it can't. So it's not really worded super helpfully in the concept itself or in indeed the service literature, because the mechanism is different than what is presented. However, one does see this in practice occasionally. It's less with regard to money which is sent to the board um, by regions, and more. I'll tell you how it happens. Sometimes people get hacked off with the local intergroup because the intergroup are acting in a high-handed way, and so groups stop sending money to the intergroup, and so the power of the purse does actually get implemented in all sorts of ways. Anecdotally, there are instances of intergroups and regions um, getting the hump with the service structure generally, and getting the hump with the board in particular, and off their own bat saying, well, we just don't trust what the board is going to do with the money, so we're going to keep it for now. So in practice, it does happen. It usually blows over after a while. Normally what happens is everyone rotates out, a new bunch of people are there, and everyone's forgotten that they'd stopped sending the money, so they start sending the money again because no one keeps records. Um, some people keep records, okay, but very often the collective that it's all very well keeping ad hoc decisions. So sometimes an intergroup will keep records going back 2 years or 4 years or 5 years, but policy decisions which are supposed to sit there in perpetuity are very rarely recorded in a separate document, which turns into the long-term procedures. So just a footnote, if you happen to be the secretary of a region or an intergroup or a whatever, you've got minutes which record decisions as they're made, but those usually have a short-term impact. Any decision which is meant to be a policy decision which stands in perpetuity must be recorded in a separate document which is maintained and then constantly distributed to remind people of what the procedures are of the body in question, because otherwise every 2 years you get to have another discussion and vote as to whether or not a written CV is necessary. Do we need 2/3? Do we need 3/4? Do we need 1/2? If someone doesn't show up, when are we allowed to kick them out? Is it 1 strike, 2 strikes, 3 strikes? What? It keeps getting discussed every 2 years because no one records the decision. Anyway, I don't see the power of the purse being exercised except in a very short-term way. Perhaps there are examples of it being exercised in a long-term way, but I'm not familiar with them. So the system we've got is a rather peculiar one, where the board has the legal power, but in practice there's this higher invisible structure. There are 3 other schemes which were considered but rejected in the process of devising the concepts and the structure that we have today in the World Service Manual. The first one is this notion of conference itself being the legal body. So rather than just being a sort of ragtaggle bunch of people that show up with their knitting and their thermos flasks, a conference might have been an actual legal body. So if you were voted in as a conference delegate, you would have become a director of this legal entity with all of the legal formalities that entails. But imagine a company with 120 directors. If you've got any experience of large law firms with scores of partners or associates, and the complexity of arranging for all of the legal formalities to do with their accession to the partnership and leaving the incredibly complicated. There'd be some sort of legal liability on the part of the delegates. I mean, that would make people run a mile. But the delegates wouldn't have, if you're going to have legal liability, legal responsibility for the affairs of AA. You've got to have the expertise, you've got to have the involvement, you've got to have the authority, you've got to be there the whole time. It's no good turning up once a year and being given legal liability and responsibility for the whole fellowship for 2 days, and then you're sent home again. Meanwhile, the whole thing is running behind your back, but you're legally liable. That's not going to fly. So they rejected that idea. The second one is that so the trustees, they appoint them that they it's like a fast breeder nuclear reactor. They propagate themselves. So you turn around, suddenly there's a new trustee. They seem to pop out of the ground. Now, what happens is in Great Britain is regions propose a couple of people, and they have to propose at least 2, or they can't propose at all. And then the board selects one. So the board selects its own successors. The alternative to this would be to have nationwide elections of trustees. Now, potentially you could do that. It would be incredibly cumbersome. It would be very hard to acquaint those voting with the skills, the experience, the personalities of the people involved. It wouldn't be an informed decision. It could be a political battle. It could be a beauty contest. I've seen votes. I should be very careful about what I say here. You see votes sometimes, still being careful, where you can tell that what's going on is not an assessment of the actual expertise and qualifications of the individual, but who's cute, who do people like, who's funny, who's interesting. It's not really a sound assessment. It's people vote in those sorts of things very much on instinct. It's not really the best way of choosing trustees. The trustees are very careful about who they choose as the next trustees. It's not ideal, but it's better than this alternative of it going out to the whole fellowship to choose the trustees. Now, conference could nominate and elect trustees, as opposed to the region sending up people they're very familiar with. But again, you're not going to know the trust. In London, someone gets nominated from the Highlands and Islands. We're not going to know who they are. We're not in a good position to assess all the new trustees coming in every year. So the situation we've got is odd, but it's the best of the available alternatives. You can only pick between the available alternatives. That's a useful principle in life. You can only... So the thing that you have to do is terrible. Well, maybe it's less terrible than all of the other alternatives. So suck it up. So the way it works in Great Britain, as I alluded to, is a region will nominate 2 candidates, the board interviews them, or grills them, as they put it. The board knows what it needs, and it chooses someone that complements the existing complement of trustees, and then they put the candidate to conference for ratification. And this arrangement, it reflects 3 aspects of the traditions and concepts. The first one is tradition 2, this notion of trusting your trusted servants. So a huge amount of trust is placed in the board. Secondly, right of decision. You're letting the board get on with it. And leadership. You're letting the board not just be rubber stampers, but to actually be visionary in how they implement ideas. So the question is, can the board say no to conference? In principle, it can, but in practice, it's used very, very sparingly. And when the board resists in some way, the fellowship just ups the ante the next year. And all the conference questions are now about, the thing which the board resisted the fellowship on. So it's no good, the board resisting repeatedly, because it just gets pushed back from the fellowship. But it does happen. Where it happens is for good. I've only ever seen it done for formally for good reason. Sometimes decisions just can't be implemented because of the board's governing legal documents, or because of company law, or because of charities law. So suggestions to do with donations sometimes will break charities law, so they can't be implemented. They in fact had to get a whole new Act of Parliament in the United Kingdom to enable AA to operate. And it's something to do with the I can't remember the exact details, but the how donations come in. They needed to change the law to make it feasible. So there's actually an Act of Parliament about Alcoholics Anonymous, but that's I don't know a huge amount about that. The board can veto if it thinks that AA's public relations or the perception of AA as a whole could be negatively affected, or if the plan just is unworkable. So it's for good reasons and usually practical material reasons. It's not for theoretical reasons. It's just it can't be done in the way that the fellowship wants. And what happens is the board will go back to the conference and say, you need to reconsider this. We can't do this in the way that you've recommended. And ultimately, it can basically veto it and just ignore it. It's also got financial veto. If the board wants to, it can underspend compared to what is recommended, but it can't overspend. So that's concept 7 in its application within AA. But I think this is a very interesting one when it comes to life and applying the concept in all of one's affairs. And so I think I mentioned this before, this distinction between mind, I'm going to say something about my own personal belief about mind. Now, I didn't suck this out of my fingers, as the Germans would say. This is an actual theory in physics, okay? So it's going to sound hokey, but I can give you the names of physicists who believe this. Okay, so one notion in physics is that human consciousness does not reside, or rather, is not a function of the physical brain. So, one theory is that you turn off the physical brain, poof, there goes consciousness, no longer exists, so that the brain is producing consciousness. The alternative view is that the physical brain is like a receiver for consciousness, which enables consciousness to come down and manifest on this plane. Now, if you think that sounds hokey, think about a radio, which doesn't, let's say you're listening to the Archers on the radio, all of the little characters in the Archers are not sitting inside your radio box. So when you turn off your radio, you're not killing Jill Archer. Jill Archer still exists as this character in the ether. All your radio is doing is you're tuning it in, and it accesses something which is there the whole time. And radios can be tuned to different frequencies. The physical body gets tuned to different frequencies. The physical brain is part of the physical body. A lot of people don't realize that. Like at some instinctive level, they think the brain is like somehow a separate thing. Like you see this in AA. I mean, I was like this. I can do whatever I want to my physical body, and it won't affect my mind, or it won't affect my brain. It won't affect my physical. So there's a difference between the physical brain and mind, which is this consciousness which gets channeled through the physical brain. And so, as I said earlier, conference is like this consciousness, and the physical brain is like the board which plans and executes. Now, the reason this is relevant in my life is that Ken Wapnick, who is Wapnick. So I don't know how familiar anyone is with A Course in Miracles. But he was the one who basically edited it down from the material scribed, as she put it, by Helen Schucman. in the late 60s, early 70s. So he's, if you want the resident expert on A Course in Miracles, it's pretty much Ken Wapnick. He was also talkative, which is very helpful, and he knew lots of people with recording devices, so there's unbelievable amounts of recordings of his stuff. So if you find A Course in Miracles confusing, which you will, because it was scribed by Helen Schuckman, if you listen to Ken Wapnick, it will make the whole thing make sense in rather an extraordinary way. And he says one of the mistakes of Course in Miracles students is that he said, it's so disconcerting. You're at dinner with one, and you can see them trying to contact the Holy Spirit to decide whether they're going to have chicken or fish. The realm of the spirit, I don't think, is there to be contacted for where am I going to put the comma in this sentence. The realm of the spirit, my morning meditation has got two elements. I've got the element where I contact higher forces for the purpose of policies on policy decisions on large matters of general policy and finance. But then there's the practical stuff. What order am I going to do things in? There I'm not accessing higher functions. I'm accessing common sense, experience, all sorts of instincts to do with my knowledge of the physical world. So there are two levels at which decisions get made. This higher level of policy and the lower level of planning and execution. And nothing I've ever conceived of at the higher level of mind and consciousness has ever been implemented practically exactly as it was envisaged in, dream time. So all sorts of other factors come into play. There are unforeseen factors. There are complicating details of implementation. There's the involvement of third parties. And so just like the board, whatever lovely recommendations come down, the board is bound by the manifest laws of the material world. In the same way, I can have like perfect inspiration from a higher power, but then be bound by the laws of the material world. And things are not going to work out exactly how I thought they were going to, and I've got to go with the flow and adapt. If you don't adapt, the world will break you, is my experience. So you've got there's a subtlety there. Yes, the higher realm is in charge in terms of large decisions of policy and finance, large matters of policy and finance. But the material implementation is bound by the laws of the material world. Let's have another little look. So empowerment. So the board's power derives in three ways. It's got legal power under its charter and bylaws. It's got traditional power, which is the inspiration of the fellowship. And traditional power is an interesting thing. It gets talked about a lot. No one asks what it means. Traditional power is where you accord someone power because you decide to, and it becomes the habit to. It becomes no one's forcing you to. That's what a tradition is. It's something you do because at some point you decided to, and you just carry on. And it remains a tradition until you revoke the decision. And this is very like the submission to the higher power. No one's making you do it. It is by tradition. You made a decision and you're stuck to it. So there's freedom there. And also the board is empowered financially by the fellowship. And in the same way, I'm empowered at three levels, legally, as it were, legally, traditionally, and financially. And the equivalent of the legal empowerment is I'm empowered by the manifest laws of the material world. I've got physical attributes. I have a physical body. My physical brain has certain aptitudes. That's like the framework within which I can operate. It's just like the board operates within its legal framework, which dictate what it can do and what it can't do. My physical body, my physical brain dictate what I can do and I can't do in the material realm. And then there's the traditional. So the equivalent of the traditional empowerment is when I voluntarily submit to the higher forces of the realm of the spirit through step 11. And I love this. On page 86, the 3 levels at which it can be accessed are inspiration, intuitive thought, and a decision. I was in a meeting in San Antonio yesterday. That's San Antonio. And someone was saying, you have to remember that God's first language is silence, and God's second language is intuitive thought. Like wordless thought, just intuition beyond language. I think that was wonderful, and I think it very much reflects what's in the big book. The third form of empowerment, so we've got the physical empowerment, we've got the spiritual empowerment, we've got the equivalent of the financial empowerment. So the practical resources that God provides me through various channels. So my relationship with God, the idea in the program is that God directs, and God directs me in 2 ways, either through the internal channel of my relationship with the higher power, or through the group conscience. And Dennis F. talks about this a huge amount. So sometimes you'll get direction from, you pray to God, and then someone in your family asks you to do something. Someone in your group asks you to start doing something, stop doing something, or to do it differently. And you don't go, well, my higher power didn't tell me that, so you can go and, the higher power will speak to me through other people. Jim W. says, that our job is to help the rest of God's kids get their heart's desire. What if what they want is crazy and pointless? Well, as long as it doesn't harm them, give it to them. So if someone asks for something, just do it, unless it's crazy. An employer can be the channel that my higher power uses. Other authorities in the world, authority figures more generally. And my job is to obey, however. And this is the relationship between conference and the board, yet again. I have autonomy and responsibility in the material world in how I obey. So I am allowed to push back in terms of, like, clients ask me to do stuff. I'm totally allowed to push back and say, I think actually the way you've designed this work sucks. It really ought to be done a different way in order for the client to be benefited, or it's not feasible in this way, or whatever. So I get to exercise that autonomy and responsibility and veto. I get offered all sorts of work which is rubbish, and I veto a lot because it's crazy, and it's unethical, or it's inefficient, or it's ineffective, or something. And here's a strange thing. So in the Old Testament, there's an awful lot about punishment by God. But the curious thing I found with disobeying spiritual laws is, like, if the thunderbolt came down straight away, it will be really clear that you've done something wrong. But sometimes the consequences are slow burn. You don't notice straight away that your disobedience to spiritual principles is actually sowing discord in your life. You just wake up depressed 15 years sober. You have no idea why. How does God exert that authority? So in the same way that conference can't manipulate or direct the board directly, because God has given me autonomy, rather than God coming down and, like, taking charge of me like I'm a zombie or something, that traditional authority gets exercised in all sorts of ways. It gets exercised through my conscience, when my conscience tells me I've done something wrong. So rather than, let's say I'm about to do something wrong, a physical barrier doesn't come down to stop me. If you want to act out left, right, and center, God ain't going to stop you. Not, the roadblocks are not going to appear. You're going to be allowed to do it. And just because it works out doesn't mean that you're therefore doing God's will. That's one of the fallacies you hear in AA. Because it works out, it was clearly God's will. My friend Tom points out that on the belt buckles of German soldiers marching into Poland in 1939, it said "God with us." And for a while, for a few months, certainly, in the first few months, if you'd looked at uh, Poland and Germany, you would conclude that Germany was doing pretty well. Was it doing God's will in Poland in the first few months of the Second World War? Probably not. So just because things are going well doesn't mean I'm doing God's will. Just because things are going badly doesn't mean I'm not doing God's will. Because God doesn't act at that level. I'm given autonomy at the material level. And that autonomy means that consequences may come quickly or they may come. So there will always be consequences. But how they're going to show up, when they're going to show up, that's an entirely different question. So back to the point of how does God exert this traditional authority? So it's through my conscience. My conscience will prick me. Secondly, you've got the four mechanisms which are used when someone exercises right of decision in AA and the fellowship doesn't like it. Censure, redirection, reorganization, or replacement. If you keep getting sacked, if you get sacked once, well, that could mean there could be 100 reasons. If you get sacked 4 times in 1 month, it's you. If you meet an arsehole, you've met an arsehole. If you meet 4 arseholes, you're the arsehole. That idea. Censure, redirection, reorganization, or replacement. Um, uh, I've been encouraged to keep an eye out for other people's negative emotional reactions, complaint, criticism, objection, non-compliance, withdrawal. Now, it doesn't mean that, someone at rejection, people making suggestions, just because other people are responding negatively, again, does not necessarily mean this is God speaking through them. But if it keeps happening, it needs looking at. If one person takes issue with me, I might be at fault. If everyone's taking issue with me, I'm probably at fault. But the literature is very interesting about this. Certainly the concepts literature. Sometimes a minority of one is right, and we mentioned this another time, that sometimes the group conscience or the conscience of the fellowship gets expressed through a single minority voice. So the vote by conference is not expressing the consciousness of the fellowship, is expressing some kind of ego manifestation, and the conscience is carried by a single minority voice. And you see this in social movements and in history, where there's only one person who's right, and a couple of them. Galileo, let's just name names here. There are times when a tiny minority is right. So when I get a bad reaction from other people, I've got to look at it, sift it, and see if there's anything in it, but then cheerfully discard it if there isn't. And there's Bill W.'s essay, How to Handle Destructive Criticism, which is very helpful on this question. But criticism is a way in which I think my higher power talks to me. So to access this traditional authority, I've got to be aware of what is going on. I've got to critically examine how other people are reacting to me. Seek the counsel of others and discuss things with others. So this concept talks about the power of the purse, where the fellowship can cut off the resources to the board. If I go too far off track spiritually, the supply of spiritual power is going to get cut off. And it's just like with a water course, a body of water. If there isn't an inlet with water coming in and an outlet with water going out, the water becomes stagnant and smelly and stinky. Not even frogs like it anymore. And that's what I get like. Now, if you cut off the flow of water into a pond, it's not like the next day the whole thing is green and stinky and smelly. You're always going to look like you're getting away with it for a while. What's a while? Could be a few days, could be a few months, could be a few years. I'm sure you've heard people in AA saying, in a step meeting, well, I've never done the steps and I'm 27 years sober, so I don't see what the point is. Just, consequence doesn't always hit straight away, but it will hit. And it hits when I start to become filled with negativity, when I start acting out, when I start wanting to act out, the flow has stopped. So God is exercising power of the purse. The flow of resources, spiritual resources into me has stopped. Sometimes God gets my attention through rather drastic actions by other people. Um, you keep getting dumped. You keep getting sacked. People don't want to hire you. No one wants you around. The world keeps saying no to everything you do. No one invites you to participate. These can be signs. Um, So, although I've got autonomy, if I exercise that autonomy recklessly, there are going to be consequences. But I do have absolute freedom at the level of my decision and action. But just because I'm free doesn't mean I'm free to avoid the consequences. There's a wonderful sign I saw outside a shop locally where it said, "Well, well, well, if it isn't the consequences of my own actions." Yet people never, sponsees call up and say, I'm full of resentment. Like someone has poured it into them, like someone else has poured it into them and gradually glug, 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 and it comes all the way up. That's not how it works. What I have to become aware of is if it's on my plate, I probably ordered it and the destination was probably clearly printed on the ticket. Those two ideas, to take responsibility for for how I'm experiencing life. One story on consequences. I don't know if I've mentioned this one. I apologize if this is a repeat. Um, there's a novel, I think, by Jean-Philippe Gonassia, a French author. Um, It's called The Club of the Incorrigible Optimists in English. And I think it's called that in English. I read it in French. There's a kid in there. He's 16 or 17. He comes back from summer holidays and his best friend has moved away somewhere else. No call, no letter, no note, gone. No forwarding number, just gone. And this kid goes to see a bloke an old Russian emigre who works in a camera shop, and he tells him this sorry story of being abandoned by his best friend. And the older Russian emigre pauses for a long time. Good sponsor. Pauses for a long time and then says, I have two things to say. Firstly, you have lousy choice in best friends. You chose a best friend who would abandon you. You need to look at the choices you're making of best friend. Secondly, your best friend abandoned you. What makes you so abandonable? Try saying that in a meeting. No one will go for coffee with you afterwards. I'll tell you, I know because I've done it. I've tried that. This will not win you friends in AA. But now other people have responsibility too. But I've got to take full responsibility for the consequences of my actions. And there is always a decision based on self. Did I not set the ball rolling? Page 67. So to keep my spiritual purse full, to be given the resources by the higher power, directly through my spirit or through the way the world responds to me, I need to stay spiritually awakened. I need to have my primary purpose being to carry the message of AA and to practice the 36 sets of principles in all my affairs. Sometimes people like to attach a single word, being the principle of the step, or the principle of the tradition, or the principle of the concept. And it's cute, but I don't think it's helpful, because there are lots of principles attached to each step, tradition, and concept. If I act against the traditional authority, the funds are going to dry up. Now, the question of veto comes in. The board can legitimately veto the conference recommendation. Now, the question is, can I legitimately veto God's will? If God asks me to do something, do I have that right of veto? And I think there are three things to say about this. First of all, sometimes, so this is a charitable example. Sometimes sponsees are going to say they feel really uncomfortable about making an amend. And bad sponsor says, well, you're just obviously not willing. Well, maybe that's the case. Maybe their instinct is rightly telling them that making the amend the way they're anticipating making it would be a catastrophe. Once I was very, very frightened. I had a lot of anxiety. And someone said, I was trying to get rid of the anxiety. And someone said, that's your last shred of sanity. Your fear in this situation is the only thing which is keeping you attached to reality. You need to get out of this situation, get out of it quick. And they were right. All of the surface rationalizations were the BS. The fear was actually what I needed to be listening to. So sometimes when I veto, it's actually God's will which is vetoing my ego, but it looks like it's the other way around. Secondly, I can temporize almost indefinitely. I can veto God's will almost indefinitely. But there's a great line in A Course in Miracles where it says, people's threshold for pain is really fudging high, but it's not infinite. Eventually, everyone breaks. Now, and this is the great thing, if I'm going to break eventually, I might as well break now. Like a friend of mine says, look, at some point you're going to become a yoga practicing vegan, so you might as well make the switch now. It'll just make it a lot easier for everyone. You'll be more pleasant to be around. So I can temporize almost in outside issue. I can temporize almost indefinitely, but not permanently unless it kills me first, which is another option. Sometimes people temporize and temporize and temporize and then splat, they're gone. And I come back and God's plan A was just waiting for me the whole time. Here's an idea. This idea I think is I got from, but all these ideas I got from somewhere else. I've originated nothing. Just I need to say that as the legal disclaimer. At any given time, there are 15 board members, 20 board members, and you've got a fellowship of 50,000 people. The board is like the material manifestation of God's will being done in the world. And the board members, they exist as members of AA, part of this universal consciousness, on and on and on. And suddenly, for 3 years, they're a board member. Then they're gone again. And this is an old spiritual idea. It's in Ecclesiastes, it's in Psalm 90, I think. This idea that, your life, you think it's so long, it's not. It's a breath's worth. So, and people's time on the board, it's a breath as part of a much bigger picture. And that perspective I find super helpful. This is my turn on the material plane. I get to do some stuff, but it is not it's where I'm staying. It's not where I live. There's a difference. It's not where I ultimately belong, which means I can take everything with a pinch of salt. You have to discharge your duty as it is placed before you, but there is a greater reality. Father Paul Coutinho, a Indian Jesuit, you know he's a Jesuit because the name Coutinho, lots of Portuguese and Spanish names of Jesuits in India, says that material reality is about 1% of the whole thing. Emmett Fox describes if you took a cow or a house or a something and you did a cross section, you'd have a two-dimensional view. How much would that two-dimensional view, how much would that two-dimensional cross section tell you about the whole thing? So the difference between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions is pretty radical. And if you add the 4th dimension, imagine that it's all 4 dimensions or 5. You know, physicists talk about there being multiple dimensions, almost impossible to conceive of. If you think about how inadequate 2 dimensions are for describing a 3-dimensional world, so the same is the case with 3 dimensions and 4 dimensions, like trying to understand the 4 dimensions or the multiple dimensions from a 3-dimensional perspective, you can't even start to do it. But to recognize that there are dimensions beyond, you know, the avocado and the gas central heating and all of the other physical things there is more to life than avocados and gas central heating. And I'm going to return to that higher plane just as the board members dissolve back into the fellowship when they stop being board members, hopefully they dissolve back in the fellowship and don't linger like ghosts. So I'm going to go back to some other higher reality. What else? Oh, I think I've talked about, yes, my last points I've already incorporated all the way through, but it's just this simple idea that although I appear to be bound by physical reality, I'm actually, of physical laws, material laws, I'm actually bound by spiritual laws which are invisible but much more powerful. And now Emmett Fox talks about this. He's got a very good book, Power Through Constructive Thinking. Some chapters are amazing. Other chapters are spooky and kooky. So the stuff on reincarnation is our link between, he talks about our link with the spirit plane being through this bluish grey ethereal ligament or something. There's some really strange stuff, but there's some amazing stuff in there. And he talks about appealing from the lower physical law to the higher spiritual law. And he talks about it within the context of actual miracles. But I think you can see it in certain people around you in AA who are super effective, and they get done what it shouldn't be possible to get done in a human life. It looks like the laws of physics are almost being broken in terms of, you see the physical recoveries which people demonstrate over decades in AA, and it's exactly the same thing. It should not be possible, but it happens, and it seems to happen when higher spiritual laws are invoked. The Bill W. essay on constructive criticism. Let's see if I can find it quickly. Constructive. Found it. Okay, so it's April 1959 Grapevine article. Leadership in AA, ever a vital need. Yeah, so concept 9, so we're going to cover this in a couple of weeks. Concept 9 refers to this outside essay called Leadership in AA, and within that are some paragraphs on how to deal with how to deal constructively with destructive critics. And there are a couple of private letters where he does the same as well. But that's your main reference there. So I think it should be in the World Service Manual. It's like an appendix to the essays on the concepts, and in some publications they're embedded in concept 9. Right, it's got to 11 o'clock, so I'm going to shut my trap now. Thanks for listening.